Infected wounds and amputation experiments. Imagine this: a prisoner's leg is amputated, bacteria are deliberately introduced into the wound, and the doctors give him neither medicine nor antibiotics. His body shivers, his fever rises, and pus fills the wound. He writhes in pain, fear, and helplessness. Nazi doctors used these horrific methods to mimic battlefield injuries. First, the legs of prisoners were amputated, then bacteria like tetanus were injected directly into the wounds. The goal was to observe how infection spread and to develop measures for wounded soldiers. The subjects were not treated. Medication was often withheld intentionally so that the natural process could be studied. Some survived for days with severe disabilities. Others succumbed as the infection spread. This kind of cruelty was ethically unacceptable, and similar experiments were banned under international law. If you're sensitive and already feeling disturbed, it's best to stop watching here. High-temperature experiments. Imagine a prisoner locked inside a narrow, metal-lined room as the temperature climbs a little higher every minute. At first, the skin touching the metal starts to burn. Soon, the heat and humidity make breathing nearly impossible. Nazi doctors at Dachau carried out high-temperature experiments designed to find the limits of the human body. Prisoners were kept in special chambers, while researchers raised the heat in a controlled way and recorded how the body responded. In some cases, the conditions became so extreme that people fainted, suffered hallucinations, and developed first-degree burns. The stated aim was to learn how soldiers or pilots might fare in searing environments. But these trials destroyed people not only physically but mentally as well. Headaches, nausea, loss of consciousness, and eventually organ failure were common. Most victims were left with permanent injuries, and many died. So here's the question. If you were a scientist in Nazi Germany and ordered to carry out experiments like these, would you do it? Electric shock experiments. Picture this: a prisoner strapped to a chair, wires fixed to his arms and chest. At the doctor's command, a surge of electricity flows through him. His body convulses, muscles tighten against his will, his breath cuts short, and screams fill the room. Nazi doctors carried out these experiments to study how electric shocks affected the human body. At Dachau and Natzweiler in particular, they tested both prolonged low-voltage currents and sudden high-voltage shocks. Some victims suffered torn muscles, heart rhythm disturbances, even temporary paralysis. With stronger shocks, unconsciousness, cardiac arrest, and death became common outcomes. For the victims and their families, wasn't this tragedy unbearable? Some tried to justify the experiments by claiming they were meant to see how soldiers might react to electric weapons or accidents during the war. But of course, that excuse was never accepted, and experiments like these were banned under international ethics. Saltwater and electrolyte experiments. At the Dachau concentration camp, Nazi doctors carried out one of their most merciless experiments, testing how long the human body could endure seawater. Prisoners were denied food and fresh water for days, forced instead to drink only salt water. Some were subjected to even harsher conditions. The salt levels were raised, and doctors watched to see how long their bodies could survive. As the hours dragged on, lips split open, tongues swelled, stomachs twisted in unbearable pain, and confusion set in. With their electrolytes thrown off balance, victims suffered crippling cramps, kidney failure, and terrifying hallucinations. Some, driven mad by thirst, began licking the walls of their cells or even tried to drink their own urine. The supposed goal of these trials was to find ways for stranded pilots or sailors to survive at sea during wartime. But the knowledge gained through such inhumane methods brought little to no scientific progress. After weeks of torment, the subjects were left either permanently damaged or dead. Cold, clinical reports detailed their agony with chilling detachment. Experiments like these were, of course, banned. But let me ask you this: if your own government had carried out such trials during the war, how would you have reacted? Water immersion and drowning experiments. One of the most painful experiments conducted at the Dachau concentration camp was the water immersion and drowning tests. Prisoners were plunged into ice-cold water, sometimes held under for several minutes. Their bodies, forced to hold their breath, quickly lost oxygen. Muscles seized, lungs burned, and panic set in. When they were pulled from the water, some lay unconscious, others hovered on the edge of death, and many never came back at all. In certain trials, victims were submerged repeatedly as doctors tested artificial respiration or different rewarming methods. The stated purpose was to determine how downed pilots or soldiers might survive after falling into freezing waters. But in reality, the outcome was almost always the same: death. As the minutes dragged on, the human body simply gave out. Prisoners drowned or their lungs collapsed under the weight of the water. Even in the rare best case, Oxygen deprivation triggered hallucinations and stripped the body of control. Their desperate struggles were logged in cold, clinical notes, turning torture into so-called science. In the end, the data gathered brought no benefit to humanity after the war. Instead, these brutal experiments were condemned worldwide and banned under international law. Poison experiments. At the Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen concentration camps, Nazi doctors carried out poison experiments that stand among the darkest crimes against humanity. Prisoners' food was secretly laced with arsenic, strychnine, or cyanide, while their reactions were coldly documented, minute by minute. In other cases, the toxins were injected directly into their veins to study how quickly death would set in. The purpose was twofold: to develop covert methods of incapacitating enemy soldiers and to test whether antidotes could counteract the effects. Victims first suffered nausea, violent vomiting, and convulsions. Soon their heart rhythms faltered, their bodies collapsed in spasms, and they died in unbearable pain. Those who somehow survived were forced into further rounds of testing, exposed to new combinations of poisons. In some trials, antidotes were administered in an attempt to reverse the effects, but most of these efforts failed. Imagine, for a moment, being in the place of these victims and their families, whose only crime was simply existing during wartime. How would you feel? These so-called experiments are remembered today as crimes against humanity, and such atrocities were, of course, banned forever. Forced sterilization and fertility experiments. One of the darkest ambitions of the Nazi regime was so-called population engineering, carried out in the name of preserving racial purity. In the Auschwitz and Ravensbrück camps, thousands of men and women were subjected to forced sterilization experiments. Prisoners were taken into these procedures without explanation. High doses of radiation were applied directly to their reproductive organs, causing unbearable burns, internal bleeding, and permanent damage. For women, the uterus and ovaries lost their function. For men, the testicles. Many were left unable to have children for the rest of their lives. It didn't stop there. Chemicals were injected to test new ways of suppressing fertility, and in some cases, surgery was performed to remove the uterus or testicles entirely. For the survivors, the outcome was a lifetime of pain, disability, and scars carved deep into their bodies. Isn't that heartbreaking? These crimes against humanity are remembered as some of the most horrific acts of the war, and experiments like these have been banned across the world. Poison gas experiments. Picture this: prisoners locked in chambers filled with poison gas. Breathing becomes harder with each second, their eyes burn, their lungs feel as if they're being torn apart. Nazi doctors carried out these experiments to measure how quickly toxic chemicals would destroy the human body. Some victims collapsed within minutes. Others endured prolonged agony, suffocating slowly or dying after their organs gave out. After the war, the reports of these experiments exposed in detail the torment the victims suffered and the sheer brutality of what took place inside the camps. Experiments like these, marked forever as crimes against humanity, were later outlawed by international treaties.